Let's turn today to 1 Corinthians and chapter 9 and verse 24. In the previous verses, we have been considering how Paul gave up his rights as an apostle. Remember, he began this chapter by seeking to defend the fact that he was a true apostle of the Lord. And it's very interesting how he goes about to establish that point and that fact not by the means that we would normally employ, recounting the miracles that were done through his hand, but rather by his way of life, his self-denial. His self-denial was the proof that he was an apostle. And he goes on further in verse 24 on the same theme of self-denial, of giving up his rights. He's spoken about giving up his right to eat and drink in verse 4, to have his meals at the expense of other Christians. He'd given up his right to marriage, verse 5. He'd given up the right to be supported by others, verse 6, down to verse 18. And he had even given up the right to please himself, verses 19 to 23. He was willing to deny himself the pleasure of pleasing oneself by being willing to adapt himself to the circumstances in which he found himself in the midst of different types of people in order that he might win them. Thus, he became a servant to them. When it says in verse 19 that he made himself a servant of others, the way he made himself a servant of others was by becoming to them what they were, so that he might win them. And now in the last few verses, he speaks about his self-control concerning his own bodily passions. And this is a very important thing for anyone who would be a true servant of God. In fact, the whole of 1 Corinthians chapter 9 is a tremendous passage for those who seek to serve the Lord. It teaches us what self-denial means. It teaches us the right attitude towards money. It teaches us that even though we have certain rights, we are not to claim them if we are God's servants. It teaches us that we cannot serve others until we are first free from them, that we cannot allow anybody to tie our mouths because he pays us a salary, that we must be willing to become weak to those who are weak, and adapt ourselves as far as possible externally to other people in order to win them, that our ultimate goal everywhere must be to win people, verse 19, that everything in our life must be directed towards the proclamation of the gospel and the work of the Lord, as we see in verse 23, so that we can become fellow partakers of the gospel. That is, the benefits that come through the gospel, souls being converted, we ourselves find our satisfaction in that. We are shareholders in the gospel, and the dividend we get from our shares is souls coming to Christ and the church being built. And that is what we are looking for. Not money, not position, not honor, not respect in Christian circles, but people being one. This is how we are fellow partakers or shareholders in the gospel. And that is the only right attitude by which anyone can proclaim the gospel. And he goes on to say, you don't have to do all these things in order to just be a Christian. But if you want to win the prize, then you have to be wholehearted in giving up even your rights. He says, don't you know, verse 24, that those who run in a race all run, to be sure. All the runners can compete, but only one receives the prize. What he's saying is it's very easy to compete in a race. Anybody can do that. Even a slow runner who is indisciplined can compete in a race. But it's quite another thing to win in the race. And he says, you must run, verse 24, in such a way as to win. Your mind must be fixed on winning the prize when you run. Now that is not the attitude of many Christians, unfortunately. Many Christians have the attitude that if I get to heaven somehow or the other, I'm all right. Let me enjoy myself here on this earth as much as possible, so long as I believe in Jesus Christ and I get to heaven. Now, Paul was more than 1,000,000 miles away from such an attitude towards the Christian life. His attitude was exactly the opposite of all that. He was not just thinking of competing. He was not just thinking of getting a last seat in heaven, scraping there by the skin of his teeth somehow or the other. He was not thinking in terms of going to heaven at all. He was thinking in terms of fulfilling God's will here on this earth in the one lifetime that God gave him. Is that your aim? Is your only aim in life to go to heaven when you die? Or is it that in the years that God gives you here on earth, you might use every bit of your energy, time, life, money, home, family, everything for the sake of the gospel? That's what he says in verse 23. Everything for the sake of the gospel. That should be our motto. The motto of a spiritual Christian is what is described in verse 23. All things for the sake of the gospel. Let's repeat that to ourselves. Everything for the sake of the gospel. Everything for the sake of the gospel. That was Paul's attitude. And therefore he ran not just to compete, but to win. And he says, how can you run in such a way to win? You have to have self-control. Verse 25. Everyone who competes in games exercises self-control in all things. He exercises rigid self-control. He trains himself by being temperate in all things. An athlete who's out to win the 100 meters race in the Olympic Games disciplines himself in his eating, exercises himself regularly day after day after day after day, and finally wins that Olympic gold medal. And he says these people do it to receive a perishable wreath. There was a wreath crown given those days to the winners of races. But he says we are in a race to win a crown that is imperishable, an incorruptible crown that will remain as part of our glory for all eternity, not just some empty physical crown put on our heads. This imperishable crown is a certain quality of character, a certain glory of God that will be our permanent possession for all eternity. That's going to be our reward. And he says, just think, if people can discipline their bodies so much and deny themselves so much in order to win just a gold medal in an Olympic Games, how much more we should be willing to deny ourselves when we are going to get something far greater than the greatest gold medal that any Olympic winner ever won. He says, as far as I'm concerned, verse 26, I've realized this. Some of you Corinthians are so carnal, babies, you don't realize this. But I've realized it. He says, therefore, as far as I'm concerned, I run in such a way, with a clear goal ahead of me, not uncertainly without aim. I run straight to the goal, with purpose in every step. There is a goal I have. The goal is to become more like Jesus Christ, day by day, and to become completely like Him finally. The goal is to fulfill every part of God's will for my earthly life. And he says, I'm running for that. I'm disciplining myself. He says, I'm fighting to win. I'm not just shadow boxing or playing around with imaginary people in front of me. I'm really fighting evil spirits. He says, I'm not shadow boxing. I really fight. I'm fighting evil spirits who are seeking to get control over my body through the lusts and passions that there are in my flesh. And so what do? I buffet my body. I keep on beating and bruising my body and making it my slave. How did he beat his body? He didn't take a whip and whip himself like some people used to do in the Middle Ages in the monasteries. No, that's not how he beat his body. He put to death the lusts that sought to corrupt his body. It's not by physical affliction that we keep our body under control. That is a heathen concept. No, it is through the power of the Spirit, Romans 8:13, we put to death the deeds of the body. And thus, the lusts of the body do not have any power over us. In other words, he put to death the lusts in his flesh every day, all the time. That is how he disciplined himself. There were many lusts he would like to indulge in, which would give pleasure to his body, but he would not indulge in them because he wanted to win the race. He wanted to win that final prize, that glory. He did not consider anything as important except that goal of the upward calling of God in Christ Jesus. Otherwise, he says, even though I have preached wonderful messages to other people, verse 27, ultimately, I myself can be disqualified. I can fail shamefully of that prize which God has for me. Do you realize that if the Apostle Paul himself could be disqualified, how much more there is a possibility of you and I being disqualified when we finally reach the finishing line, having no reward for us, maybe scraping through to the last seat in heaven, but no reward, no glory, because we would not discipline ourselves here on earth. If we do not discipline our bodies, we cannot be true servants of God, and we will have no reward in that final day when we stand before the Lord.